Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security have all said they represent no threat to the American people, but they have still not been released.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City and on the internet at thestruggle.org. The biggest coal-burning plant that makes electric power in the Northeast is in Somerset, Massachusetts, near Fall River. The Obama administration recently said it will be getting rid of these dangerously polluting dinosaurs, these coal-burning plants. But the regulations that it will propose might take a decade before they go into effect. Hundreds of activists, some locals who worried about the deaths already being caused by coal burning, and others worried about the climate warming effects of coal burning, descended on the Brayton power plant with a march and a demonstration calling on the Massachusetts government to close down the Brayton plant right now. We'll have video of the demonstration and the arrests. Then more of Medea Benjamin's talk in New Haven. The Code Pink leader in this segment talks about the effect of drones even when they are not being used to shoot off missiles. She's been to Yemen and Pakistan and knows about what she is speaking. She's written a book on drones, and she also talks about Guantanamo.
We will rise up like the sun on a brand new day. We will rise up. We will rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. We will rise up. We will rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. We will rise up. We will rise up. Going up mountains.
So even
For money and for greed. We keepers of the mountains. We'll fight for people's needs. We'll stop that coal from burning. We'll stop that coal from burning. We'll stop that coal, stop that coal, stop that coal from burning. We'll stop, rise up. We will rise up. Mothers out front. 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 Mothers out front.
So I understand you live in this area, is that correct?
Yes, I grew up in Somerset, Massachusetts. It's my hometown. It's also the home of the largest coal-burning plant from Maryland to Maine that is right behind us here.
I understand that a lot of people think there's some bad health effects from these plants. Could you get into some details?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've seen my nieces and nephews struggle. One of my sisters, her 3 kids, 2 of them have asthma and have to use inhalers every time they try to participate in sports activities. You know, there's a lot of questions that we have as residents as far as wondering if we live in a cancer cluster. Had 3 neighbors just around the 3 or 4 blocks with childhood leukemia. We just, you know, heart attack rates, stroke rates are higher than other regions, and those are proven consequences. Heart attacks, strokes, and asthma are all consequences that are directly related to the power plant that we're taking action against today.
Carol, you're wearing a red shirt. Means you're willing to get arrested in this action. Why?
Because it's one of the most important things I think I could possibly do. It's not just the power plant, which is enormous in itself. It's a health hazard for the people who live here. It's an enormous health hazard for the people in Appalachia who dig up the coal. But it's a huge contributor to climate change. We can't afford to continue to burn fossil fuels and expect the climate to be able to sustain it.
Mountaintop removal is just what it sounds like. It's the removal of sometimes 800 foot of the mountain, and you know, all the destruction, all the waste is shoved over into our headwater streams, which contaminates the water. Or the air that we breathe is laced with diesel fuel, ammonium nitrate, and silica dust that from the rock that they blow up, and you know, it's being deforested. You know, they've already deforested over 2 million acres doing this type of mining, and
I am risking arrest. I'm getting arrested to shut down Brayton Point. I'm doing this for one reason, because I believe that no one should die for me to have energy. And make no mistake about it, that plant kills people. It kills people in West Virginia, where we're blowing the tops off of mountains and turning people's lungs black. It kills people in Somerset and Fall River, where we have higher rates of asthma and lung disease and cancer, and it kills people through climate change. That's not an easy thing to wrap your head around, how that plant is killing people, but look at it. That is a deadly energy facility. Now I'm going to tell you a short story about how that plant is contributing to killing human beings. In the summer of 2010, Russia experienced an unprecedented heat wave. Before that summer, the city of Moscow had never seen temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And over a 2-week period, they broke that record not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 8 separate times. The city of Moscow saw temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the first time in recorded history. And so most folks do what people do in heat waves, right? They didn't have air conditioning because it was Moscow. So they opened their windows to let the cooler air in, particularly when it got cooler at night or in the morning, right? To get that hot heat in their house out of the windows. It's just like when you're in a car, there's a baby or a dog in the car, you want to roll down those windows because they will bake inside. The same general principle applies in your house. So people open the windows to get that fresh air, that cooler air circulating. The problem with that strategy was that that same heat wave caused all the forests near Moscow to catch on fire. So people had a choice to either open their windows and let in the cooler, smoky air into their homes, or to shut their windows and to bake inside their homes. Put yourself in their shoes and think about what you would do. Raise your hand if you would open your windows to let in the cooler air with lots of smoke into your home. Raise your hand if you would decide to keep your windows closed and suffer with higher temperatures. Raise your hand if you'd get the hell out of Moscow. A lot of people did. The foreign embassies shut down. The United States told our embassy staff to evacuate and to leave Moscow until it's safer to return. But the problem with that strategy is that not everyone can leave Moscow. There are a lot of people who didn't have the wealth, didn't have the access to transportation, didn't have the flexibility in their employment where they could just leave town for a couple of weeks. They had responsibilities for their jobs, for their families. And over that 2-week period, when faced with that choice of opening their windows to let in the smoke or closing their windows to bake inside their homes, 11,000 people made the wrong choice. The wrong of 2 bad choices, and they paid for it with their lives. 11,000 people died in Moscow from smoke inhalation or heat exhaustion. Across Russia, 50,000 people died that summer from that heat wave. And that, my friends, is not the end of the story. Because that same heat wave decimated Russia's wheat harvest. And Russia is traditionally the 3rd largest exporter of grain in the world. And after their wheat harvest was destroyed, a quarter of it was just flat out gone, and the rest of it was lower yields, they banned the export of wheat, which meant that food prices went higher around the world, but particularly in a part of the world right near Russia that imports 50% of its food from abroad. I'm talking of the Arab world. You think of the Arab world, you think of oil and deserts. There's not lush green valleys filling it. They have to import a lot of their food. They import 50% of their food from outside of the region. Egypt imports 50% of its grain from Russia, which means when Russia stopped exporting grain, the Arab world, and Egypt in particular, saw much higher food prices. That was in the summer of 2010. As you know, grain lasts a little while, so you don't feel that price spike immediately. But in December of 2010, a young man in Tunisia who could no longer afford to provide for his family set himself on fire in protest of the economic conditions in his country. And that was literally the spark that started the Arab Spring. Now don't get me wrong, I thought the Arab Spring was a beautiful, beautiful thing to see people rising up and demanding their freedoms, demanding human rights and liberty. But the honest truth is that those desires for human rights and for liberty existed in the spring of 2010 and the spring of 2009, and they would have been there in the spring of 2012. But the reason we saw the Arab Spring happen in the spring of 2011 was because food prices were dramatically higher across the Arab world, and people who were afraid to take to the streets lost their fear when they could no longer feed their families.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
We record this just days after warnings by the Obama administration that there are new terrorist plots against the U.S. And yesterday, new drones were fired against Yemen, an ally of the United States. Now to more of Medea Benjamin's talk in New Haven.
There was a study done by the two very prestigious universities, Stanford University and NYU, that brought out some very important issues that I incorporated into my book, Drone Warfare, because they said, don't just look at the number of people who have been killed and the number of people who have been maimed by our drones, but also look at the psychological terror of the drones to entire communities. Because these unmanned vehicles don't just come into a community, drop a bomb, and leave. They stay in the community doing surveillance for days, weeks at a time. Sometimes they're flying very low, and so the people hear the buzzing of the drones constantly and live in fear, never knowing when these drones are going to drop a missile, if they're going to, where it's going to be, who is going to be killed, are you going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And so the study, Living Under Drones, says the drones are really a way of collective punishment. They're a weapon that terrorizes entire communities. Well, as we learned in Pakistan, the Pakistani people have been protesting on every single level, from the community level up to the legislature, and even the highest officials in government, like the newly elected Nawaz Sharif, said that the U.S. must stop the drone attacks, met with the U.S. ambassador immediately after winning the elections. And has the United States listened to anybody in Pakistan? No. Continues with the drone strikes. When we were there, as a delegation of 34 Americans, we did protests in the capital of Islamabad together with drone victims. We did a day of fasting to commemorate the drone victims and show our opposition. And we tried to join a caravan up into the tribal areas where the drones are killing so many people. The government stopped us from getting as far as we wanted to get. But when we did get right into the border of the tribal areas, we had a rally, And we were able to go out and meet with this sea of local people who came to see these Americans. And I think both Tig and Chelsea will agree with me that we were all quite scared because we had been told by our ambassador, don't go up to those tribal areas. The Taliban know you're coming. You have been on the TV screens every day. You've been in the newspapers. They're waiting for you. They will try to kill you. Our delegation went anyway, and when we got out into this crowd and heard the shouting, we didn't know what they were shouting until we made out they were saying, welcome, welcome, welcome. We want peace. We want peace. And as we had a chance to talk to them and tell them how upset we were with our own government's policies and how we thought that their lives were as precious as our lives, that their children were as important as our children, and that we would go back to do everything we could to stop these barbaric drone strikes, we just heard these tremendous cheers from the local people who had never heard Americans saying anything like that, and were so happy that we had come from so far to give out that message. Well, the same drone strikes that have been so counterproductive in Pakistan and led 3 out of 4 Pakistanis to call the United States its enemy have been stepped up in another country, and that is Yemen. Tig and I just returned with a small delegation from Yemen, but before we met, we were amazed that for the first time ever in the US Congress, they actually invited somebody from Yemen to come and testify about the effects of the drone strikes. And this young man testified on April 23rd before Congress. Well, he had been a journalist who had been doing some research about the drone strikes, but he never had any direct contact with them until the week before he was to come to the United States. Now, this is a young man from a very poor family in a very poor village, and he had had the great fortune of getting a scholarship to come as an exchange student in high school to live in the United States. And during that year, he fell in love with the United States, he fell in love with the American people, and we went back to his village into Yemen, talking about how great the United States was. So imagine 6 days before he's supposed to come to the United States, a drone is fired into his small village. And he said before Congress, "My village is so small it doesn't even appear on Google Maps. I would have never believed that it could be the site of an American drone strike. But my village first experienced America through the terror of the drones. What radicals had previously failed to achieve, one drone strike accomplished in an instant. Now there is intense anger and growing hatred of America." And this young man is afraid to go back to his village because he's now associated with the United States. When we were in Yemen, we had a chance to speak directly to people who lost their loved ones through drone strikes. This man traveled to the capital to meet with us. He has in his hand a picture of his brother and his nephew, who were taxi drivers. His brother was an educator by day, and to make some extra money for the family, drove a taxi at night. And one day, he was driving his taxi. 4 guys got into the taxi. They were driving along, and suddenly, they were killed by a Hellfire missile. His brother and nephew had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. In fact, he got the Yemeni government to give him a certification saying, "My brother is a school teacher, nothing to do with militant activities." When Mohammed came to meet us, he brought the children who have now lost their father because of this drone attack. And he also brought with him pieces of the Hellfire missile that he carries around with him, with markings showing that it came from the United States. He told us that he thought the United States was a country of laws, that he had thought previously that perhaps the people who were being killed by the drones deserved it, because he didn't know any people who were killed by the drones until it happened to him. And now he says, what kind of barbarism is this? Something coming from the sky, killing my brother. And then when I try to get some acknowledgement, why did it happen? Nobody will talk to me. Nobody in the US Embassy will talk to me. They won't even acknowledge that they killed my brother. They won't apologize. They won't provide compensation so that I can take care of his children. When we asked how his brother's wife was doing, he said, "Not a day goes by without her sobbing. She just wakes up, eats, cries, and goes to sleep." And the US will do nothing to apologize to her. This is just one example of the many examples of families whose lives are destroyed by our drones. But you might say these are foreigners. Americans don't care very much about the killing of foreigners. Well, how about the killing of 16-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, an American citizen killed by a drone attack in Yemen by the US government? And as we started out with a moment of silence for Trayvon Martin, we should also think about this 16-year-old, somebody who's actually killed by President Obama's policies. It's President Obama's drone policy that led to the death of this 16-year-old American. The family, we met with his grandfather while we were there, has still not received any kind of explanation from the US government about why this 16-year-old, together with his teenage cousins from Yemen, were killed in a drone strike. When we were there, we did protests in front of the US Embassy. We took on the two issues, the drone strikes and also the indefinite detention in Guantanamo, because the majority of people who are still in Guantanamo are coming from Yemen. The majority of people in Guantanamo who have been cleared for release, meaning Department of Justice, Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, have all said they represent no threat to the American people, but they have still not been released. And so we stood in front of the American Embassy with family members who have loved ones in Guantanamo and family members who were killed by the drone strikes, to say to the US Embassy, we demand justice. Unfortunately, we didn't get a response, although we did succeed in convincing the US ambassador to meet for the first time ever with the Guantanamo families. And that just took place several days ago. But it seems like the ambassador got very scared and in the end decided that the meeting could not be face-to-face, even though the US has every kind of security at the embassy that you can imagine. They still would not let these families inside the embassy. And so they had to have the, quote, meeting with the ambassador by a video conference, which the family members were so upset about. And they had the meeting, but the ambassador just listened and said that he was not a policymaker. There was nothing that he could do. So one has to ask the question, how is it that the United States gets away with going anywhere it wants, killing anybody it wants on the basis of secret information? And what if any other country in the world were doing this to us? It would be a declaration of war. But we shouldn't feel smug that no other country can do this to us because we are the mighty and we are the ones that have this awesome technology. Well, this is not like nuclear weapons. This is a technology that is being sold overseas by US companies that make the drones. The #1 exporter of the drones is the Israeli companies. In fact, one of their marketing bonuses is that they say that the drones are constantly being battle tested because they are constantly being used against the Palestinian people. The other country that's very big in the drone business is the Chinese. And there are now over 70 countries that have some kind of drone, the majority of them for surveillance purposes, but so were our lethal drones first surveillance drones, until we weaponize them. And there are many countries that have already or are in the process of weaponizing their drones. We must think that what goes around comes around, and we've got to be thinking about what is going to happen as more and more countries get these drones and start using them the way the US is using them. We also have to think about what's going to happen when our skies are full of drones. And there's only one reason why they are not right now, and that is because the Federal Aviation Administration is in charge of our airspace, and they know that these drones crash all the time. They know that these drones don't have the same kind of visibility as piloted drones have. But in the good old American fashion, the drone manufacturers have created a strong lobby group, and that lobby group now has its own drone caucus in Congress, and that drone caucus in Congress has pushed through legislation that says by the year 2015, the US airspace must be opened up to drones.
A note about an upcoming event. Believe it or not, the Struggle Video News has been on for 10 years. We've been cablecast weekly for all that time, and we're coming up on our 500th show. We'll be premiering it at the New Haven Library on the 11th of September in the evening. For full details, go to our website, thestruggle.org. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.